What were the inhuman and immoral activities of the British in India during their rule? 14. ANS. While British rule in India brought certain modernizing influences like railways, the telegraph, and a unified legal system, its tenure was also deeply scarred by numerous activities that can be categorized as inhuman and immoral, driven primarily by economic exploitation, racial superiority, and the imperative to maintain political control. Systematic economic exploitation and induced poverty. The British systematically dismantled India's indigenous industries, particularly its thriving textile sector, to turn India into a supplier of raw materials for British factories and a captive market for British manufactured goods. High tariffs were imposed on Indian textiles in Britain, while British goods entered India with minimal duties. This deindustrialization led to widespread unemployment among artisans and weavers. Agricultural policies were designed to maximize revenue. The permanent settlement in Bengal, for instance, created a class of zamindars, landlords, who often exploited peasants, leading to indebtedness and land alienation. Forced cultivation of cash crops like indigo, as depicted in the Blue Mutiny, and opium, which was then coercively exported to China, devastating Chinese society, often came at the expense of food crops, contributing to food insecurity. The drain of wealth, where India's resources and revenues were siphoned off to Britain without adequate return, impoverished the nation. Deliberate famine policies and neglect. India experienced numerous devastating famines during British rule. While droughts were natural causes, British policies exacerbated their impact catastrophically. The prioritization of revenue collection even during famine, the export of grain from famine-stricken areas, the failure to implement adequate relief measures, and laissez-faire economic ideology that resisted market intervention led to millions of deaths. The Great Bengal Famine of 1943, where an estimated 2 to 3 million people died, is a stark example. Winston Churchill's government was accused of diverting food supplies for the war effort and displaying callous indifference to Indian suffering, with Churchill himself reportedly expressing contempt for Indians. Racial discrimination and social apartheid. A profound sense of racial superiority underpinned British rule. Indians were systematically excluded from high administrative positions, senior roles in the army, and exclusive European clubs and social spaces. They faced daily humiliations, being treated as second-class citizens in their own country. Public spaces like railway carriages often had compartments reserved for Europeans only. This institutionalized racism denied Indians dignity and opportunity, fostering deep resentment. Brutal suppression of dissent and political repression. NY challenge to British authority was met with ruthless force. The suppression of the 1857 uprising involved widespread massacres of civilians, summary executions, like blowing rebels from cannons, and collective punishments. Later, nationalist movements faced similar brutality. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar, 1919, where British troops under General Dyer fired on a peaceful, unarmed crowd, killing hundreds and wounding over 1,000, is an infamous example of state-sponsored terror designed to quell dissent. Repressive laws like the Rowlatt Act, allowing detention without trial, and the Vernacular Press Act, censoring Indian newspapers, curtailed civil liberties. Divide and rule policies. Population, the British strategically exploited and to maintain control over a vast and diverse population, the British strategically exploited and exacerbated existing social, religious, and caste divisions. They introduced separate electorates for different religious communities, more Minto reforms, which sowed the seeds of communal politics and ultimately contributed to the tragic partition of India in 1947. This policy, while politically expedient for the British, had devastating long-term consequences for social harmony on the subcontinent. Indentured labour system. Following the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, the system of indentured labor was introduced to supply cheap labor to colonies like Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, and Guyana. Millions of Indians were recruited, often under false pretenses or coercive conditions, to work on plantations in conditions that were little better than slavery. They faced harsh working environments, poor living conditions, and abuse, with limited rights or recourse. In conclusion, while proponents of British rule might highlight its contributions to infrastructure and administration, these were often secondary to the primary imperial objectives. The inhuman and immoral activities, from economic devastation and famine neglect to racial subjugation and violent repression, inflicted deep and lasting wounds on Indian society, economy, and psyche, the legacies of which continue to be debated and felt today.